Not so long ago, El Salvador was one of the most crime-ridden countries in Latin America. But in less than a year, it has somehow managed to cut its murder rate in half, a serious achievement for the El Salvadorian government, and one that most Salvadorans are quite happy about. So, how did they do it? How has El Salvador been winning its war against some of the more violent gangs in not just Latin America, but the world has ever known? Is there something the US could learn from their efforts? To beat the gangs, they did what you'd expect any reasonable government to do. They started putting criminals in prison. Simple, right? Not exactly. You see, the El Salvadorian government didn't just throw a few criminals in prison. They started putting a lot of criminals behind bars. Tens of thousands of them, in fact, and all in a relatively short period of time. In what has become an ongoing tidal wave of searches and sweeps orchestrated by highly equipped military and police forces, nearly 70,000 people have been arrested in less than 2 years. This has put a massive dent in El Salvador's infamous problem of gang violence and affiliation. But these enthusiastic roundups have also created the necessity for so-called mega prisons. And given this relatively small nation of around 6.5 million people the honor of having the highest per capita incarceration rate in the world, some 605 prisoners per 100,000 citizens as of December 2022. For more than 30 years, savage transnational gangs like MS-13 and Barrio 18 have with impunity used extortion, murder, kidnapping, and rape to establish control over the lives of millions of Salvadorans. But not anymore. Now, any individual who's even suspected of engaging in or supporting gang activities in any way will likely disappear into one of the country's perilous and overcrowded prisons, where they could be detained indefinitely without ever seeing the inside of a courtroom. The government of El Salvador has chosen to send a clear message to the country's gangs: not on my watch. So, how did we get here? This shift in strategy and the harsh policies behind it can be traced back to one man, President Nayib Bukele, who, after assuming the office in 2019, pledged to reverse 3 decades of unchecked gang terrorism. And staying true to his word, that's exactly what he's been trying to do. Mostly by waging a full-on war of attrition against El Salvador's most notorious criminal organizations, a large-scale battle that officially kicked off in March of 2022, after 87 people were murdered by MS-13 in a span of 3 days. Since then, Bukele has leaned on a number of controversial measures in order to gain the upper hand on the gangs, including the suspension of certain constitutional rights, such as due process and the right to defend oneself in court, not to mention the implementation of a nationwide state of emergency. However heavy-handed his approach has been, though, the results he's produced seem to speak for themselves. With an approval rating that consistently hovers around 90%, Bukele is widely regarded as the most popular president in Latin America. Perhaps because, after coming out strong with promises of repairing El Salvador's international image and declaring war on organized crime, he has successfully accomplished a seemingly impossible feat, reclaiming entire neighborhoods by reducing the influence and presence of gangs. But before we can understand the ambitious, semi-authoritarian president's motivations for going to war with the gangs, we must first ask, who is Nayib Bukele, and how did he become El Salvador's youngest president? Well, before Bukele was sworn in as president at just the age of 37 and began his 5-year term as the youngest head of state in Latin America, he grew up in the capital city of San Salvador, mostly as a privileged outsider. Bukele's father, a Muslim businessman of Palestinian descent, owned a public relations firm and was a prominent figure in the nation's capital. He was also known for, among a range of other accomplishments, establishing the nation's first McDonald's franchise. He was also a practicing polygamist who had 6 wives. So it might go without saying that Bukele grew up in a large family, one that included 3 brothers and 7 half-siblings. As a young man, Bukele attended a bilingual private school, which might partially account for his patient, well-practiced English, where most of his affluent peers shared his personal ambitiousness and conservative family values. Still a young man, Bukele's journey into politics began when he left college to manage a nightclub in downtown San Salvador, before ultimately taking charge of his father's public relations firm. A few years later, in 2011, Bukele embarked on a self-funded campaign aimed at the mayorship of Nuevo Cuscatlan, a municipality considered part of the metropolitan area of San Salvador, a campaign that he won by a margin of less than 2%. Eager to charge ahead politically and encouraged by his current party, the Farabundo Martin National Liberation Front, or FMLN, one of the two major political parties that emerged during the Salvadoran Civil War, Bukele's next target was the mayorship of San Salvador, a job widely seen as a stepping stone to the presidency. But by this time, he could already feel his individual influence growing. He decided to shut the party out of his campaign, seeking support from connected family members and old friends instead, and entered the 2015 mayoral race as an independent candidate, a successful maneuver that allowed him to tap into anti-establishment sentiments and attract a diverse range of supporters. Born in 1981, Bukele lands right on the border of Gen X and Millennial, which means, unlike many of his predecessors and older opponents, he rose to power in the age of the internet and social media. And because of this, Bukele has been able to bypass the traditional media and reach a massive audience, to whom he's portrayed himself both online and in person as a free-thinking truth-teller, eager to shake up the political landscape and go against the status quo, an image he fully legitimized when he chose to turn his back on the FMLN. But it would take more than being snubbed on Twitter for the FMLN, the left-wing party of the previous two presidents, to officially boot Bukele out of their party. It didn't help that Bukele had already developed a reputation for overlooking required permits and disregarding zoning regulations in his administration. But then he was accused of throwing an apple during a city council meeting at the council's legal director, who he directly accused of conspiring with his critics against him. But even after all that, what ultimately got Bukele expelled from the party was his desire to run for president, with or without the party's support. Ultimately, he was voted out of the party, which really only worked to his benefit, as it left him free to officially announce both his candidacy for president and the formation of his new party, Nuevas Ideas. But along with his newfound freedom, Bukele also developed a staunch resistance to any critiques of his policies or leadership. And in response to what he came to see as unfair personal attacks, he was about shaping an alternative, more friendly media landscape for himself. One that consisted of TV programs, a network of Twitter trolls, an army of YouTubers, and several publications that posted favorable stories on Facebook. And whether it had been his intention all along or not, it's hard to say. But by publicly breaking off from one of the country's major political parties, he was able to position himself as a lone warrior fighting against political corruption. A stance he made abundantly clear when he began using the campaign's slogan, "There's enough money to go around as long as no one steals." In the end, Bukele's ethically questionable strategy worked like a charm. And in February of 2019, with just 53% of the vote, he won the presidency and eagerly stepped into a political vacuum left by the country's two, now discredited, historic parties. Bukele and his sprint upward through the political ranks, from mayor of a town of less than 10,000 to the mayor of the nation's capital, to becoming the youngest president the country has ever had, symbolized a new chapter in El Salvador's tumultuous political history. Or so it seemed. Despite Bukele's largely anti-corruption platform, it didn't take long for his government to take on an eerily autocratic feel, especially after the legislative and municipal elections occurred 2 years later, and Nuevas Ideas won 56 of 84 seats in the Legislative Assembly and 152 of 262 of El Salvador's mayorships. The elections were generally considered to be free and fair, but it was still a landslide victory that effectively gave Bukele control of the country's Congress. So you might be wondering, who is Bukele really? Is he the real deal, a true advocate for change, or simply another political opportunist full of inflated promises he won't ever deliver on? Well, if nothing else, he's certainly been able to stir up controversy and generate a serious amount of hype. But Bukele's popularity, although bolstered every step of the way by a thorough propaganda campaign, also seems to be based on tangible, positive results. Several of his initiatives, including his handling of the COVID-19 pandemic, his commitment to various public infrastructure projects, his push to increase the country's minimum wage, and his attempts to maintain low gas prices, have all been widely popular and successful. Perhaps more importantly, though, he's also managed to ignite a sense of hope and national pride in millions of Salvadorans, a cautious optimism that seems to be rooted in the notion that El Salvador is finally getting its affairs in order. But perhaps the biggest boost to Bukele's popularity, and what very well may be his legacy as president, is the war he continues to wage against the country's deadliest gangs. To varying degrees, gang violence has been a prominent part of daily life for many Latin Americans. Extortion, kidnapping, murder, smuggling, and other brutalities have persisted since the late 1990s, largely due to the social, economic, and political instability that was left after the Civil War. And in the past few decades, every Salvadoran president has struggled with the issue of gang violence. One past administration implemented a policy known as mano dura, or strong hand, that involved deploying soldiers to impoverished neighborhoods to round up suspected gang members, effectively filling the country's prisons. Another administration implemented something called super mano dura, and you can probably guess what that looked like. But then came Nayib Bukele, who, ironically, while serving as the mayor of San Salvador, actually criticized aggressive policing tactics like these, calling them not only impractical but immoral. Well, all of that changed in the span of 3 days, when members of MS-13 murdered 87 people in a gruesome killing spree that shocked the country. In El Salvador, gang violence has always been a problem, but this was different. This time the victims were mostly innocent civilians with no gang affiliation, and this time the underlying message of the killings was intended to reach a singular figure: Bukele. As for why the gangs were trying to intimidate Bukele, 2 theories have emerged. The simpler of the two is that the newly appointed president had been making noise about drastically reducing gang-related crime in an attempt to repair El Salvador's image abroad. So, in an attempt to show him who was boss, members of MS-13 started killing people, having at least one body on the road leading to Surf City, a coastal area that Bukele had revitalized and renamed in the hope of attracting international tourists. The other theory is a bit more complicated, if not surreal. According to several sources, including the U.S. Embassy in El Salvador, the U.S. Treasury Department, and El Faro, an online newspaper previously headquartered in San Salvador, as the story goes, back in 2020, at the start of Bukele's term, at least 2 government officials directly negotiated with leaders of El Salvador's 2 largest gangs, MS-13 and Barrio 18, establishing a tentative truce between the gangs and the state. The chief of the Salvadoran penal system and the vice minister of justice and public security, Osiris Luna Mesa, and the chairman of the Social Fabric Reconstruction Unit, Carlos Amilcar Marroquin Chica, were both accused of arranging and participating in a number of secret meetings with incarcerated gang leaders, eventually establishing a secret truce. In exchange for government protection against extradition to the United States for certain gang leaders, better treatment for gang members already incarcerated, and other financial incentives, the gang leaders agreed to offer their political support and, more importantly, reduce the number of homicides in the country. Allegedly, some imprisoned gang leaders also received extra special treatments, including access to mobile phones and prostitutes. Despite some pretty solid evidence, when the news of these negotiations came to light in August of 2020, Bukele and his office vehemently denied that any such deal was ever struck. Then why, many have asked, would a spokesperson from MS-13 claim publicly that their 3-day killing spree that left at least 87 people dead and the whole country fearing for their safety was the gang's response to the government breaking their 2.5-year truce by luring a number of the gang's leaders to a meeting, then arresting them? Secret truce or not, either way, Bukele proved he would not be bullied. And to make this perfectly clear, in March of 2022, just days after the killings, the Legislative Assembly implemented a 30-day state of exception, which gave authorities the power to arrest anyone suspected of gang affiliation and hold them without trial indefinitely. Gathering in groups larger than 2, except for religious services, sporting events, or meetings for cultural and economic purposes, also became, for the span of several months, an arrestable offense. The Legislative Assembly also amended the criminal code to allow for 10 to 15-year prison sentences for anyone convicted of creating, reproducing, or transmitting any visual content related to gangs or gang activity. And the new rules also made it so all minors swept up in Bukele's siege on the gangs could be charged as adults. To many, this sounds overly harsh, oppressive at best, and autocratic at worst. And it's true that many innocent individuals have found themselves in prison simply for being in the wrong place at the wrong time. But as uncomfortable as it might be, we can't ignore the fact that these radical changes have also produced tangible results. Before Bukele, gang members were known to stop anyone who lived in another gang's territory from entering theirs, for whatever reason, even if they were traveling by public transport. People were forced to present government-issued identification to verify their address, and if that person was found to be living in a rival gang's territory, they could easily be denied entry, beaten, or even killed. Bus companies were forced to pay bribes simply to operate within a certain gang's territory. But as Bukele's 30-day state of exception kept getting extended and gang activity countrywide continued to decrease, freedom of movement for civilians has steadily increased. Not completely, though. Even if the state of exception didn't specifically mention travel restrictions, Bukele did warn citizens shortly before its approval that the measure could include temporary closures in some areas, which mostly took the form of government security forces and police restricting access to certain low-income communities that were known to be hotspots for gang activity. Now, more than a year and a half into El Salvador's state of exception, which has been largely characterized by sweeping arrests, excessive force, the erosion of many civil liberties, and continued accusations of human rights violations, Bukele has remained adamant that this has always been part of his recipe for success. His plan, he's said, has always been dependent on breaking from established strategies in order to forge ahead, despite criticism. Even as representatives from the United States and European Union have come down on him for some of his more questionable actions as president, mainly his intentional manipulation of the country's constitution, which would have prevented him from running for a second term. Bukele's typical response to the meddling of foreign governments has been essentially to tell the US and EU that it's none of their business, while also pointing out that El Salvador is a small country that plays a relatively small role on the global stage. For decades, Bukele has said, El Salvador has done what other nations have said was best. Protected by foreign powers, the government handed the country over to the right. Protected by other external agents, power was handed over to the left. And all that came of this back and forth was more poverty and more violence, while fundamentally the system, the institutions, and the laws all stayed the same. Despite the autocratic tone of Bukele's presidency, it's important to reiterate that since he launched his territorial control plan in mid-2019, El Salvador's murder rate has been cut in half. And a wave of public support has followed, with 95% of Salvadorans stating they approved of the new security measures. Because the gangs have for so long controlled large swaths of the country, demanding money in exchange for allowing even the most basic economic activities, this has made the crackdown widely popular. So far, Bukele's war on the gangs has taken the form of checkpoints, random interrogations, and massive sweeping raids. Recently, an army of some 1,000 police officers and 7,000 soldiers fanned out across Cabañas province, setting up checkpoints on all roads leading in or out. There have been many other such raids, which have involved thousands of troops and officers, but this recent one followed on the heels of an attack on a police patrol vehicle that left 2 officers wounded. In past raids, government troops and police have rounded up large groups of people, often based solely on how they looked and where they lived. Mass arraignments, at which judges have faced anywhere from 50 to 500 defendants at once, have also been carried out. Unfortunately, during these sweeping judgments, documents and other evidence that might speak to the character of those facing charges has been regularly ignored. And if this wasn't enough to raise the alarm amongst various human rights groups, to even keep up with the ever-increasing number of arrests and expedite the tens of thousands of cases awaiting trial, El Salvador's Congress has also started allowing for mass trials. A questionable practice that also necessitated the construction of a new maximum security mega prison with the capacity to house 40,000 inmates. The building of this prison, officially named the Center for the Confinement of Terrorism or CECOT, and Bukele's ongoing campaign to fill it, have raised a number of serious concerns regarding human rights violations. Within the 8 main cell blocks, the cells are divided into modules. Each module contains 2 toilets and 2 washing basins, but the water is controlled by guards from outside the cell, and 80 bunks without mattresses for more than 100 inmates, giving each prisoner about 0.6 square meters of space. At CECOT, prisoners don't receive visitors. There are few, if any, rehabilitation programs, workshops, or educational programs. And as of July 2023, Bukele's new mega prison was home to more than 12,500 inmates. Before the crackdown, most of El Salvador's notoriously violent and under-resourced prisons were already operating at 120% capacity. And in the past, notably during the Sanchez-Seren administration, the prisons themselves were besieged by various states of emergency, during which prisoners were locked down 24 hours a day, denied access to lawyers and healthcare, and were denied the ability to participate in their own trials. And only time will tell if the conditions at CECOT prove to be any better. Of even greater concern, though, is that hundreds, perhaps even thousands of innocent individuals have been swept up during Bukele's ongoing state of exception, many of them disappearing into the country's increasingly flawed criminal justice system. This situation has led to thousands of new prisoners waiting in detention, often in overcrowded or subhuman conditions, as their trials take years to play out, during which time many have died. These injustices have left many Salvadorans, as well as observers from other nations, asking which situation is worse, the iron fist of Bukele or the decades of violent oppression by the gangs. Now that we better understand life under Bukele, what was life like under the gangs? Since the late 90s, violent gangs have forced their influence on the citizens of El Salvador, but they didn't start there. In fact, the origins of both MS-13 and Barrio 18 can be traced back to Los Angeles. During a period of mass migration in the 1980s, when hundreds of thousands of Salvadorans fled north to escape the violence of the Civil War, many teenagers were left orphaned or penniless or feeling adrift after they arrived in America. Many of them were drawn to a life of crime in the inner city, where Black, Asian, and Mexican gangs were already fiercely competing for influence, illegal drug markets, and territorial expansion. Emerging within the Salvadoran immigrant community, MS-13, or Mara Salvatrucha, started as a local street gang in the Pico Union neighborhood, made up of mostly young, delinquent heavy metal enthusiasts who were tired of being victims of racial intolerance and persecution. The name Mara Salvatrucha reflects its initial members' Salvadoran roots, with Mara being a Central American term for a gang and Salvatrucha indicating its Salvadoran identity. Fueled by a desire to protect their community, in its early days, MS-13's initial purpose was to protect themselves and other Salvadoran immigrants from the more established LA gangs. And for many years, MS-13 operated on a relatively small scale, getting involved in mostly local criminal endeavors and street-level violence. But during the 1990s, a significant shift occurred. In 1996, to demonstrate its firm stance on both immigration and crime, the Clinton administration passed a law mandating the deportation of non-citizens serving felony sentences of more than 1 year. Tens of thousands of young people were repatriated, mostly young men from Guatemala, Honduras, and El Salvador, many of whom were associated with gangs. Also in 1996, the state of California greatly expanded its scope for deportable crimes. In some cases, an arrest for drunk driving or petty theft could get a person deported, no matter how long they'd been living in the US. There were, as you'd expect, a number of problems with this approach. First, the US began deporting large numbers of violent offenders without informing their home governments of their identities or the nature of their crimes. Many of these individuals had also spent the majority of their lives in the US and therefore had few, if any, connections back in their country of origin. This marked a notable turning point in the history of Latin American gangs, as deported members brought their gang's culture, structure, and criminal activities to various regions of Central America, leading to the widespread proliferation of MS-13 in not just El Salvador, but also Honduras, Guatemala, and Mexico, effectively turning MS-13 into an international phenomenon. And as their presence expanded, so did the scope of their criminal activities. And soon they'd gone from local street-level crime to drug trafficking, human trafficking, extortion, aggravated assault, murder, and organized assassinations. And as time passed, MS-13 gained global notoriety and built a fearsome reputation. By 2015, there were some 60,000 gang members in El Salvador, and 70% of the country's businesses were being extorted, leading to annual losses of $4 billion, according to estimates by the Salvadoran Central Reserve Bank. Not to mention, by this point, the homicide rate had climbed higher than it had been during much of the Civil War. And yet, despite decades of policing efforts to counter gang activity, MS-13 has remained a formidable criminal entity, partially due to its decentralized command structure, which allows each cell or clica to operate independently, which also means that MS-13 has no single recognized leader. El Salvador's second largest gang, Barrio 18, also commonly known as the 18th Street Gang, also got its start in the Pico Union area of Los Angeles, but with one major difference. Barrio 18 started as a faction of a traditionally Mexican street gang that ultimately let non-Mexicans join, an opportunity readily taken by many Hondurans, Guatemalans, and Salvadorans. The highly similar evolution of MS-13 and Barrio 18 certainly raises a number of questions regarding the complex intersection of immigration, social challenges, and the emergence of criminal organizations within marginalized communities. Which means, like it or not, that achieving victory over MS-13 or any similar gang will almost certainly require a comprehensive approach that 1. Addresses the root causes of gang involvement, 2. Improves the socioeconomic conditions of the region, and 3. Dismantles the gang's organizational structure through enhanced law enforcement capabilities. But that's not everything. To truly topple a gang as established as MS-13 or Barrio 18, there's something else that needs to be done. It's no secret that gang members use distinctive tattoos and hand signs as both identifiers and symbols of loyalty. This is so well known, in fact, that these features have become pseudo-religious, as well as synonymous with the unchecked violence and degradation these gangs are famous for, which makes destroying the images associated with a gang a necessary step in neutralizing it. This is why soldiers and police officers in El Salvador have been marching imprisoned members of MS-13 to graveyards and ordering them to take sledgehammers to any tombstones displaying gang insignias, symbols that are now illegal. Change is happening in El Salvador. There's little doubt in anyone's mind about that. And some might even say that the war against the gangs is being won. But at what cost? Bukele already announced his intentions to run for re-election next year, a historic undertaking given that prior to this there'd been a constitutional ban on consecutive terms. Still, the country's top court ruled in his favor back in 2021, and Bukele's ability to seek a second term has been a serious point of debate ever since, with many believing that it's no coincidence that the judges on that court were appointed by a Congress dominated by Bukele's party. The question is now, is 5 more years of Bukele's heavy-handed approach really what El Salvador needs? If it solves the gang problem once and for all, many might say yes, but others believe that if he keeps doing what he's doing, the next issue he'll need to tackle as president will be a human rights crisis, sparked by unlawful arrests and mass incarceration. Bukele's hyper-aggressive approach to the gang problem has won him sky-high approval ratings, which has resulted in a cult following of regional politicians set on emulating his hard-nosed policies in the hope of winning over voters of their own. But as documented complaints about human rights abuses continue to pile up, with nearly 200 people reportedly having died in state custody, there are plenty who say that the 42-year-old president is brushing aside key checks and balances of the democratic process. Many also believe that the addition of mass trials will only increase the number of innocent people being locked up and contribute to worsening prison conditions. But El Salvador isn't the only country struggling to solve its gang problem. Many nations, in fact, are seeing gang-related violence, shootings and bombings in particular, on a scale never seen before. Haiti, for example, has seen gang violence escalate and spread from its capital city, Port-au-Prince, through the center of the country to its other 2 major cities, marking a significant increase in killings, kidnappings, and sexual violence in the past few months. Since 2021, following the assassination of President Jovenel Moïse, Haiti has been plagued with political instability, and as a result, gangs have continued to increase their power to the point of controlling over 80% of the Port-au-Prince metropolitan area. And because corruption on so many levels remains endemic to Haiti, gangs have continued to operate with impunity. Take, for example, a recent vetting of the country's judges and prosecutors that resulted in about 1/3 of those evaluated losing their certification due to a lack of moral integrity, invalid credentials, or the unlawful release of criminals. Haiti's police force, too, despite an increased budget, have been unable to deal with the gangs, as they grapple with a constantly declining workforce due to resignations, dismissals, retirements, and fatalities in the line of duty. To paint a picture for you, in the first 6 months of 2023, they lost some 774 officers, more than 5% of the total force. At the moment, much like El Salvador, Haiti is facing serious problems related to mass incarceration, as over 80% of their current inmate population is being detained pre-trial, most in alarming conditions. Another nation that appears to be struggling is Honduras. Following Bukele's example, the current president, Xiomara Castro, has declared war on gang-related extortion, something the left-wing leader sees as a very serious problem that not only causes economic stagnation, but fuels violence and has forced countless Hondurans to leave the country. But like most wars, this has been a battle against an enemy and for control of the popular narrative. In this case, the Honduran government has also been fighting allegations that it simply hasn't done enough to combat crime. And many exasperated Hondurans are all but demanding to see extreme measures, and appear to be willing to trade some of their constitutional rights for sustained security, which is why Bukele's victory at all costs approach and its associated positive outcomes appears to have found a welcome audience in Honduras. Despite some similarities, however, the security situation in El Salvador is different from that in Honduras, which has a much larger territory, higher population, greater poverty, and a more diverse set of criminal groups. Perhaps taking these differences into account, at one point, Honduras appeared intent to follow another neighbor's example, Nicaragua, whose softer, community-based approach to policing resulted in years of exceptionally low crime rates and minimal gang presence. Until, that is, the government took an approach similar to El Salvador's and turned the police into a repressive military force. In the past, after a community policing model was announced, Honduras made moves towards demilitarizing its public security forces with the hope of increasing the public's trust in a historically corrupt institution. But it seems the political gains to be made by emulating Bukele's approach were too tempting to pass up, and Honduras ended up declaring their own state of emergency in December of 2022, which will similarly suspend certain constitutional rights and allow for the detention of anyone suspected of criminal activity, and has since been extended several times. But it isn't only developing nations that are having problems. British Columbia, for one, recently received more than $54 million in federal funding to help tackle its expanding gun violence problem. The funds are part of the government's $390 million investment in a series of countrywide programs aimed at the prevention of gun crime and gang violence. The full amount will be provided over the next 5 years as part of the initiative to take action against gun and gang violence, which was first announced in 2017. Concerns about gangs have continued to grow in BC as the province's 10-year-old Lower Mainland gang conflict, a gang war stemming from a local dispute that began in the city of Abbotsford's Townline Hill neighborhood, went province-wide as gangs that had once been centered in the Vancouver area began to move around the province, expanding their drug territory and, as a result, spreading violence. And for another example, let's take Denmark. To counter rising gang-related crime, its government recently presented a new package consisting of 39 anti-gang measures. Among those measures are stricter regulations for juveniles and a push for families to step up and take responsibility. The package also includes tougher penalties for gang members, additional policing tools, and initiatives designed to prevent gangs from recruiting young people. For this especially has been a significant concern for the Danish government. The boldness the gangs have shown in their recruitment of children, not to mention actively involving them in criminal activities, has been shocking. Shootings and stabbings have also become a concern, which is why many of the new measures are aimed at the use of dangerous weapons, including double sentences for gang members who use knives to commit violence and harsher penalties for knife possession. The Danish government has also laid out harsher penalties for economic crimes and acts of so-called humiliation violence, which is defined as emotional abuse aimed at creating a feeling of shame or worthlessness in its victims. But Denmark isn't the only Scandinavian country having problems. Historically, one of the most peaceful countries in the world, Sweden, has seen a recent surge in gang violence unlike anything it's ever experienced before. In 2022, in fact, Sweden recorded over 60 shooting deaths, the highest figure on record, and was on track to match or exceed that number in 2023. Media reports have linked the recent surge in violence to a feud between rival factions of a criminal gang identified as Foxtrot, or the Foxtrot Network, Sweden's main distributor of illegal narcotics. And it appears that Sweden's Prime Minister Ulf Kristersson has had just about enough, meeting recently with the head of the country's military to discuss how they might work together to tamp down this unprecedented surge in shootings and bombings. For years, Sweden has been able to manage its relatively small problem with gang violence, but now with incidents happening almost daily and many of the victims being teenagers and innocent bystanders, the escalation in gang violence has been impossible to overlook. And so, in response to the evolving nature of the country's criminal activities, the Swedish government has also begun to overhaul its criminal code, implementing changes intended to expand policing power, allow for longer prison sentences, and provide better protection for witnesses. Highlighting the need for comprehensive legal reforms, Prime Minister Kristersson reportedly said that Swedish laws aren't designed for gang wars and child soldiers. To make matters worse, Sweden's gangs have been known to recruit teenagers from disadvantaged immigrant neighborhoods, which has invariably raised questions about Sweden's historically liberal immigration policies. And as a result, Swedish lawmakers have spent the past year tightening down on immigration, with the hope that this might help to mitigate the country's rising crime rates and other social issues. This marks a drastic change for the country, given that alongside Germany, Sweden has long stood out for other European nations for readily welcoming hundreds of thousands of asylum seekers from the Middle East and Africa. Unfortunately, the new policies implemented by Kristersson's center-right government that took power last year while promising to get tough on crime have done little to stem the violence. Leaders from Denmark have also pointed out that a significant portion of the country's gangs are made up of young people from minority backgrounds, many of whom, after struggling to integrate successfully into Danish society, have been forced to seek community and security elsewhere. The fact that gang violence and immigration are complex issues that have long been intertwined really can't be understated. Which means that to truly understand either issue, various social, economic, and political factors must be considered. Drastic changes in immigration policy and the stigmatization of immigrant communities will only serve to further complicate the issue. People often migrate to escape violence, poverty, and political instability, or to seek better economic prospects, but there will always be hindrances to social and economic integration. This is why, to effectively address these issues, it's going to require a comprehensive approach. An approach that addresses, first, the root causes of gang involvement, second, generates support for social and economic integration, and third, promotes inclusive policies for immigrants to thrive in their new communities. Because, sadly, as it stands now, young people with limited opportunities living in disadvantaged neighborhoods are prime candidates for gang recruitment. While at the same time, in many Western countries, expanding or emerging drug markets have led to increased territorial disputes, thus perpetuating the cycle of violence. For as the demand for illegal drugs increases in a specific region, so does the competition for control of the resulting market. And so it would seem that properly addressing this issue is going to require a holistic approach, one that addresses both the violence behind territorial disputes and the growing societal demand for illegal drugs. But we'd like to hear your thoughts on the matter. Is Bukele's heavy-handed approach the only way to solve the problem of gang violence? How might immigration and gang involvement be connected? Is there a connection between the increase in gang activity and the demand for illegal drugs? Let us know what you think in the comments below. And if this video interested you, feel free to check out our video on how geography made Alcatraz impossible to escape, or this other one on an island that's even worse. Thanks for watching.